Welcome to the last part of our Orchestrator series. This time we'll discuss common mistakes that happen on a production and also how one can become a professional orchestrator. So let's kick it off with this question. What are common issues or mistakes that happen on a production?
I think the first thing is delivering files. It's very important for the composer's team that they deliver the MIDI file correctly and with the stereo mix. Sometimes I've seen that maybe a couple of MIDI tracks were muted when exporting the MIDI, and so sometimes I'm hearing things in the mix and I don't see the data on the MIDI. So that creates confusion, that creates questions, and obviously it slows you down. So it's just very important that you export your MIDI with all the tracks that you want in there, and that all that data is going to be reflected in the stereo mix. Another issue, which sometimes is not really an issue, it's overwriting. So when you have a computer, again, you can do whatever you want, and it's gonna sound great, and obviously that's something that is a very creative choice. But if you are going to record with an orchestra, that's way better than writing for samples. So sometimes I find a lot of things that have been overwritten, like many lines that in the MIDI are gonna work. For example, in the strings, like too many string lines with long notes and short notes, that it can become an issue when recording with a live orchestra. So again, it could be an issue, and again, it's a creative choice. But as a composer, just think about it like what you really want to achieve if you have a full orchestra. And are you gonna end up using samples anyway? So I think you should think about like what is the music that is gonna fit the best to the orchestra. So obviously there are things we can do. Obviously we can do overdubs, but obviously you have to think about more time and more money that you have to pay during the recording session, and so you have to be a little mindful about those kind of things. And then the overwriting can become an issue, and sometimes we have to deal with that and figure out and organizing those ideas to make sure the final product and the final recording is going to reflect the composer's ideas. Another issue that sometimes I encounter is clashes, melody lines that they don't match up and down, which can be a very easy thing to do. For example, if you start writing something on the strings, and let's say you want to double up with the flute, and then you just copy paste the data, and then later on you decided like, oh, you know what, I'm gonna make a small fix in the strings, and then you do it in the strings, but you forgot that you had pasted that into the flutes or something, and it could be something that is very easy to miss, and then so sometimes that creates a little confusion because you have this line that it's going up and down the same with violins and flute, and then all of a sudden there's just one note that is different, and then you start questioning like, is that a creative choice or was that a mistake? And then sometimes we have to assess that and sometimes ask the composer, but obviously those kind of things slow down the process. But in the end, it's something that can be solved, but it's something that I see in a project. And another one is again, tempo changes, abrupt tempo changes, and time signatures that don't work. It's very easy when you're working directly into the computer. It's just very easy to put notes, and it's gonna go to the grid, and it's just gonna play fine. But sometimes I find moments where the meters don't match the music's intention, and so if you have that in front of an orchestra, the musicians might get a little confused, and so it's something that sometimes I have to assess and fix to make sure the musicians are going to read it just fine. And obviously, sometimes tempo changes can be a little challenging, and so you can also figure out things like stopping points, like recording by sections, and because there's a tempo change that is too extreme. So those are issues that obviously I have to assess and fix during the orchestration process. But those are things that come up during a project.
I've definitely done faulty file delivery, or team members have done it, where stuff wasn't lining up, or we delivered the wrong version of the audio to the different version of the MIDI or something. It happens, but we try to not have that happen. I've also done the note clashes that Andres mentioned, where you copy paste a line into a different section and you change something later, and then you didn't fix it in the other section, and then it's just confusion with the orchestrator. Because sometimes in a mock-up you don't hear it, it just gets covered up so much that you didn't hear it, and so you didn't fix it. But then in a live context you would definitely hear it, and it would confuse the hell out of the players that have the wrong note. So it's good when you have an orchestrator who catches that. I've also done the time signature thing. It's so easy to get carried away in the DAW, especially if after a phrase you still land on a downbeat again, and then you forget to change the time signatures in the middle, and then you have all kinds of weird meters going on. Or I've had it where I've written something, in what I thought was like 3/4, but it was actually 6/8 or something. But in the DAW you kind of don't notice sometimes, and then you have all that work changing it later. So it happens. Definitely, especially when you're in the flow of composing, it's just a thing. It's just that on paper later on it just makes no sense whatsoever. So it's good to have an orchestrator who catches that and goes, hey, this would be much better if we notated it differently. There's also key switches, which I don't use a lot, but if you're using a lot of key switches, give them to your orchestrator and tell them what the key switches do instead of having them figure it out by ear, unless it's super straightforward. But I've had that issue when I had to do takedowns for other composers, that they sometimes wouldn't tell me what the key switches are, and then I would just be like, okay, I guess I'm just gonna guess. So it's not ideal. There's also a mistake that I've made, track naming. Normally all the tracks are named properly in my template, of course. But what happens sometimes is that for one cue, I actually don't need, the piano. I actually need a pipe organ or something that I didn't have loaded. And then I will load that into the piano thing because I'm lazy, but then I forget to rename the piano track into pipe organ. And then the orchestrator gets a MIDI file that has piano in it, but he hears a pipe organ and is like, is this correct? So it happens. It's not supposed to happen, but it does happen. And the overwriting that he mentions happens a lot. Sometimes for creative reasons, sometimes the scene just demands it, or the video game or whatever you need, it just demands almost like a double orchestra. It happens. It's a specific style, a production type style. But as you know from my videos, I also do a lot of layering, just doubling lines to make it sound better. And those lines don't always make sense in a live context or written down. Like, I know they will serve the mock-up, but, very often, if I were writing just for live instruments, I would not do certain things. So the next question, and this is an interesting one that I've seen a lot, does an orchestrator ever change the composer's arrangement or composition?
The short answer is no. The orchestrator doesn't change or arrange the music of the composer. One of the main tasks of the orchestrator is to respect the composer's music and ideas. So, sometimes it can be misunderstanding that, if I write something and if I give it to an orchestrator, or is the orchestrator going to create new lines and change the voicings or change the instrumentation. Those are concerns from a composer when you hand out your little baby, your piece of music to somebody else. But especially in film music, the short answer is no, and especially if the composer has already a very clear plan, or if it's been written on the computer and I hear, this is strings and brass and woodwinds. Well, obviously I'm not going to change that, and obviously I'm not going to arrange that. If I change voicings, would be in a very specific cases where maybe I don't have the same amount of instruments that I see in the sequence for the samples, and let's say I have 6 different horn lines and I only have 3 horns, and maybe how can I make it work for only 3 horns, that kind of thing. But I'm not really changing the composer's idea. So the short answer is no. Now obviously an orchestrator, if the composer tells the orchestrator, look, I just have a piano part and just make your own, well, then I can obviously assign different instruments and do the orchestration, the proper orchestration. But obviously I'm not going to change the form and the music ideas.
Yeah, I very much agree with Andres here. If it goes beyond fixing things or making things playable or adjusting to the orchestra lineup that we have, I would say no, you don't change stuff. Not without prior permission from the composer, or maybe the composer asked you to do it. But this is rarely a thing. I've probably, in the past 9 years, I've had maybe 3 to 5 cues where I would ask the orchestrator to add something like a counterline or runs or something. And it would usually be a situation, it happened, for example, on Leap, or Ballerina as it was called elsewhere, where they were still editing the film right before the session, or we got some notes right before the session and something was already orchestrated. And then I would just tell the orchestrator, hey, they want some runs into this here, or can you cut this bar and add this here, or do some counterline thing here because they want XYZ. It has happened, but it doesn't happen often because this is technically the composer's job. And it's just, if it would be more work for me to add those runs, then just tell the orchestrator, hey, bar 9 and 10, can you add woodwind and string runs into bar 11? That would be so much more work for me to mock it up and then clean up the MIDI again and send it over, and then the orchestrator has to, work their way through all that, instead of just going, hey, can you add a bunch of runs here? Because they can do that in like 1 minute, so it's way less work. But yeah, other than that, it's a hard no. I wouldn't like it if an orchestrator changed my composition, I think. And remember, this is already approved music from the production. So you're not really at liberty to change it anymore after that anyway. You can't just go, I'm gonna change this melody or this counterline, or actually we're gonna take this and put it in the brass instead of this instrument. You can't really do that because the producers have already approved something, and they want the final end result to sound like that, just better. So yeah, the live recording very much has to match the mock-up, and then you layer both of them together at the end. Most people do. And that's going to be the end result for the movie. Otherwise, it might throw them off, and then they might get pissed. So that's also why technically no one, after a cue is approved, no one is really at liberty to change it that much. The same goes for mixing, by the way. Like, a mix engineer can't just fundamentally change the sound of something because the producers and the director have already approved a specific sound that they want. Next question was, what do you wish composers would do better when they deliver files to you?
Basically, the composer delivers to me two files, a MIDI file and a stereo mix. And the main thing is that they have to match. If I put this in any sequencer, I should be able to line up the stereo mix with the MIDI, and all the MIDI that is represented there is gonna sound in the stereo mix. You know, if I start hearing things in the mix that I don't see in the MIDI, well, that's a problem, and that creates questions and confusion, and then, you know, I will have to call the composer, and it's just time wasted. And remember, usually when we're doing this, we're in a crunch time, so there's not that much time that, you know, I'm just gonna call the composer for 20 questions. So, you know, if the composer has the MIDI and the stereo mix that match, it's great. Now we can talk about other details, like, for example, how clean the MIDI is. You know, that depends on budget as well, because it takes time. It takes time to clean up the MIDI before you export that into the notation software, just so you get the durations and the rhythms correctly and not shifted in weird places. So obviously, if the composer does a little work on that beforehand, you know, it's appreciated. If obviously there's not enough budget in some other projects, you know, you can have a separate budget for only cleaning the MIDI, and so, you know, in that sense, you know, the composer can just deliver a raw MIDI, but keep in mind that, you know, the composer or the production company may have to spend a little more money onto that. So, you know, that's one thing about delivering files. There are other situations where if the music has maybe triggers for special effects, or, you know, pre-recorder tracks. For example, delivering stems is very helpful, so we can identify the different melodies and the different sections that maybe sometimes we need to take that down. So, you know, that's something that we can talk about based on the project, and you know, talk with the composer what will be the delivery terms. But, you know, basically MIDI and stereo mix that match, and that's good.
Okay, so Andres is a really nice guy, and he's way too nice about the MIDI cleanup. Clean your fucking MIDI. Clean it up before sending it off. I've made a whole video about it. You can watch it. Go watch it and be a good team member. Clean up your goddamn MIDI. I always try to deliver the cleanest and most correct files, just to avoid confusion, to avoid questions. Questions cost time, and, you know, you don't want 30 questions a day, so, you know, it's the best solution for everyone. As Andres mentioned, I'm giving effects stuff separately, you know, if it's like one MIDI note but a whole thing unfolds because it's a pre-recorded effect or cluster or whatever, I give that separately in an audio file, just so they know what's happening on that one MIDI note that they're seeing, and then they have to transcribe that by ear. It's a bit of a thankless job, but I try not to use that kind of stuff anyway, so but sometimes I do. Again, if you're using key switches, tell them what they're triggering. Like, give them a PDF file or something that tells them this thing does that. But usually, and this has come up in the comments and on forums and stuff, but usually orchestrators, at least the ones I've worked with and the ones I've talked to, prefer when the articulations are actually split out on separate tracks. When people saw that in my template, they were like, oh, it's an orchestrator's nightmare. It actually isn't. And people claimed that you would have to, at the end, once you're done, when you prepare files for orchestration, you'd have to copy everything onto one track. You know, if you have like string tremolo, string legato, and string staccato, for example, that you'd have to then consolidate it into one track. That's not true. That actually makes it less clear for the orchestrator. Orchestrators usually prefer to have those 3 tracks, because what they can then do is they go into violin staccato, add the staccato dots on the whole thing. They go to the legato, and they go to the tremolo and add the tremolo thing to the whole line, and then they just pick one and they just copy paste everything into one. It takes them way less time than having one track with like key switches that are already chaotic, and then not having anything at all and having to figure it out by ear what's what's happening. So it's actually way cleaner and way clearer for orchestrators to have stuff on different tracks and have it split out by articulations instead of having everything on one track. It might be slightly different for expression maps. That might make things a bit easier. But that's about it. So yeah, that's how you deliver. You still leave them on the different articulation tracks. You don't actually consolidate them. The orchestrator will do that, but this is much easier for them. And the last question, how does one become an orchestrator, especially for film? Like, how do you find a career path into this field?
There's really no direct answer to this question because everybody's path is different. For me, I actually started studying composition and orchestration at the conservatory in Bogota, Colombia. And so my education was focused on writing scores on paper. Well, notation software, but something that you can print out and put in front of the musicians. So for me, that was my focus. I really didn't learn how to do MIDI sequences or mock-ups during my school years. And so for me, working with an orchestra and doing arrangements for live orchestra for concerts, that really helped me to build my experience as an orchestrator and as an arranger. And working with orchestras, that helped me to create my own career path. And so once I arrived to LA, I knew right away that was my forte. And so I kind of started focusing on getting jobs on orchestration or music prep. And so that was my path because that's how I was taught in school. And so it's very different for every single person. But obviously I would say if you want to become an orchestrator, you have to be a master in notation, in writing scores and working with orchestras. And you start working with small ensembles, for example, and then you work your way up until you get opportunities to work with live orchestras, big full orchestras. And so that helps you to build a career as an orchestrator. And obviously once I was in LA, I found my way to start working with other orchestrators, especially I started working for Tim Davies, who's a big orchestrator here in town. And so, from that, everything kind of started from there. And so obviously knowing your skills, your notation skills, and obviously networking. And that's how I found my path into this orchestration field. There are other fields, as I mentioned, music prep, for example, which it's closely related to orchestration. In my experience, I've worked in many projects doing different things, not only orchestration, but from doing sketches from the MIDI, cleaning up the MIDI and doing the sketches to deliver to the orchestrators. I've done, when I was working for Tim Davies, sometimes I had to clean up scores, just kind of like making sure the final score was working. Proofing is another task that is very common. So it is very important that you proofread your scores before you deliver to the stage, to the studio. And obviously copying parts, it's a very big part of music prep, and it's very important. You have to have people working and making the individual parts for the orchestra and making sure the parts match the score and that they are legible, so the recording session can go smooth and the players can read the music easily. Because remember, most of the time the players are going to read the music for the first time at the session. It's everything is pretty much sight read, so you have to make sure the parts look good. And so that's something else that you can work if you decide to go into this path.
So I haven't really been a full-time orchestrator ever, so I can only speak to what I've seen other people do and what my friends are doing. And the usual way is the way Andres says, that they first have, proper training in orchestras, and then they will work under another orchestrator, a more accomplished orchestrator, or they will actually work for music preparation houses. We have several in Los Angeles, we have a couple in London, but also like everywhere where there's a scoring stage, there's going to be music preparation, sheet music preparation happening. Some people start as music librarians and then they switch over to being copyists and doing MIDI cleanup and that type of thing, and then they switch over to being orchestrators. So there's kind of also a ladder similar to composers and composer assistants. But in any case, it requires a lot of education and a lot of experience with orchestras. Because an orchestrator has to find all the things in your music that will not translate, anticipate problems before the session even happens, fix them in advance so we don't lose precious session time, because questions during a session are expensive. Time really is money during a scoring session, especially with an orchestra. I hope you guys enjoyed these videos, and I hope this clarified a lot about the job of an orchestrator. I'll do more of these with plenty of other guests from other professions, just so we can kind of get an in-depth overview over all the jobs there are in the film score production and what these people actually do.